Picture this, a crowded shooting range in rural Texas, 1987. The air thick with gunpowder and testosterone. Veteran marksmen gathered around their usual spots, swapping war stories and bragging about their latest kills. Then, she walked in. Sarah Martinez, 23 years old, barely 5 feet tall, carrying a rifle that looked like it weighed more than she did. The laughter started immediately. Whispers turned to snickers, snickers to open mockery. One gruff voice cut through the crowd, "Little lady, you sure you're in the right place? The craft store is down the street." But Sarah had something none of them knew about. Something that would turn their world upside down in less than 60 seconds. A secret that had been hidden in the mountains of Colorado for 15 years. A skill passed down through generations of her family, perfected in silence, and about to explode into the open like a thunderclap. What happened next would become legend in shooting circles across America. It would challenge everything these men thought they knew about marksmanship, about women, and about the quiet power that sometimes hides behind the most unassuming faces. This is the true story of the shot that shut up an entire room of doubters and changed one woman's life forever. Sarah Martinez had never intended to become a sharpshooter. Growing up in the remote mountains of Colorado, shooting was simply survival. Her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had taught her the basics when she was 8 years old, not because he believed in breaking gender barriers, but because winter in their isolated cabin meant the difference between eating and starving often came down to one well-placed shot. The old man had hands like tree bark and eyes that could spot a deer at 300 yards. He'd survived 3 wars and countless harsh winters by understanding one simple truth: accuracy wasn't about strength or swagger. It was about patience, breathing, and the ability to become absolutely still inside your own mind. "Mija," he would tell Sarah as she struggled with the heavy rifle, "the gun doesn't know if you're a man or woman. The target doesn't care how loud you can yell. Only the bullet knows the truth, and the bullet goes where your heart tells it to go." Those early lessons took place on a makeshift range behind their cabin, using tin cans and old bottles as targets. Sarah's grandmother, Elena, would watch from the kitchen window, shaking her head and muttering prayers in Spanish. She thought it was improper for a young girl to be handling weapons, but Miguel was stubborn. He'd seen too many people die because they couldn't defend themselves when it mattered. By the time Sarah turned 12, she could hit a playing card at 50 yards. By 15, she was taking down elk with single shots that Miguel himself couldn't match. But nobody outside their family knew about her skill. In their small mountain community, women were expected to cook, clean, and raise children. Shooting was men's work, and Sarah had learned early to keep her abilities private. When Sarah's parents died in a car accident during her senior year of high school, everything changed. Miguel was too old to maintain the mountain property alone, and Elena needed medical care that wasn't available in their remote location. They made the heartbreaking decision to sell the cabin and move to town. Sarah used her small inheritance to enroll in college in Austin, Texas, leaving behind the only life she'd ever known. College was a culture shock. The sprawling University of Texas campus buzzed with activity 24 hours a day. Students crowded into lecture halls, parties raged in dormitories, and the city noise never stopped. Sarah felt lost in the chaos. She'd gone from a world where silence was golden to one where everyone seemed to be shouting at once. Her roommate, Jennifer, was everything Sarah wasn't: loud, confident, and completely comfortable being the center of attention. Jennifer came from a wealthy Dallas family and had never wanted for anything in her life. She found Sarah's mountain background charming at first, like having a pet from an exotic location. "You actually hunted for food?" Jennifer would ask, wide-eyed. "Like, killed animals and ate them? That's so primitive. But also kind of cool, I guess." Sarah struggled with her studies initially, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she'd never learned to compete in an academic environment. Her education in the mountains had been practical: how to read weather patterns, identify edible plants, track animals, and survive harsh conditions. Sitting in lecture halls listening to professors drone about abstract concepts felt artificial and pointless. Her lowest point came during her sophomore year. Struggling with depression and homesickness, Sarah began skipping classes and spending days alone in her dorm room. She felt disconnected from everyone around her, like she was watching life through a window but couldn't figure out how to join in. It was Jennifer who suggested the shooting range. Not because she understood Sarah's background, but because she'd started dating a guy named Brad who was obsessed with guns and wanted to impress him by learning to shoot. "Come with me, Sarah," Jennifer pleaded. "I don't want to look like an idiot in front of Brad's friends. You can at least help me hold the gun the right way or whatever." Sarah hesitated. She hadn't touched a rifle in almost 2 years, and the thought of being around firearms again brought back painful memories of home. But Jennifer was persistent, and Sarah finally agreed, thinking it might help her feel less isolated. The Lone Star shooting range sat on the outskirts of Austin, a sprawling complex with both indoor and outdoor facilities. It catered primarily to serious shooters, hunters, law enforcement officers, military personnel, and competitive marksmen. The parking lot was filled with pickup trucks decorated with gun manufacturer stickers and political bumper stickers. Walking through the front door was like entering a different world. The walls were covered with mounted deer heads, vintage rifles, and photographs of hunters posing with their kills. Glass display cases showcased expensive firearms and accessories. The air smelled of gun oil and leather. Behind the counter stood a massive man with arms covered in military tattoos. His name tag read Sarge, and he looked like he could bench press a small car. When Jennifer and Sarah approached to inquire about range time, his expression shifted from polite professionalism to barely concealed amusement. "First time shooting, ladies?" Sarge asked, his voice carrying a condescending tone that immediately put Sarah on edge. "Yes," Jennifer answered cheerfully, oblivious to the patronizing undertone. "We want to try some of those big guns you have back there." Sarge chuckled and exchanged glances with several male customers who had been listening to the conversation. "Those big guns aren't really suitable for beginners. How about we start you with something more manageable?" He pulled out a small .22 caliber rifle, the kind typically used to teach children. "This little beauty should be perfect for you girls. Nice and light, doesn't kick too much. We'll set you up with some paper targets at 25 yards. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks but said nothing. She watched as Sarge explained basic safety rules in an exaggeratedly slow, simple manner, as if they were children who might not understand complex concepts like pointing the gun down range. The outdoor range was busy that afternoon. At least 20 shooters occupied the various lanes, most of them middle-aged men with expensive equipment. As Sarah and Jennifer made their way to their assigned spots, conversations quieted and heads turned to watch them pass. Jennifer seemed thrilled by the attention, waving and smiling at the men who stared at them. She had no idea they weren't looking at her with admiration or interest, but rather with the kind of bemused tolerance one might show to a couple of children playing dress-up. Sarah, however, could read the room perfectly. She'd seen this kind of dismissive attitude before, though not about shooting. In college, professors sometimes talked down to her because of her mountain accent and simple clothes. Classmates assumed she was less intelligent because she didn't have the latest technology or fashionable accessories. But this was different. This was about something she actually knew how to do. The assigned lane was at the far end of the range, away from the serious shooters. Their targets were set at the beginner distance of 25 yards, while most of the men were shooting at targets 100 yards or more downrange. It was a clear message: this is where the amateurs belong. Jennifer went first, struggling to hold the lightweight rifle steady. Her shots scattered wildly around the paper target, most missing it entirely. She giggled after each miss, treating the whole experience like an amusing game. "This is harder than it looks," she announced loudly enough for nearby shooters to hear. "How do you guys make it seem so easy?" Several men chuckled and offered unsolicited advice. "Keep both eyes open, sweetheart. Don't jerk the trigger like that. Maybe try holding it tighter." Sarah watched Jennifer struggle for 20 minutes, growing more frustrated with each missed shot. Not frustrated with Jennifer's performance, but with the attitude of everyone around them. The condescension was thick as smoke. When Jennifer finally exhausted her ammunition and stepped aside, she looked expectantly at Sarah. "Your turn. Maybe you'll be better at this than me." Sarah approached the firing line with mixed emotions. Part of her wanted to show off, to prove these smug men wrong. But another part of her worried about drawing attention to herself. Her grandfather had taught her to be humble about her abilities, to let her actions speak louder than words. She picked up the .22 rifle and immediately frowned. It felt like a toy in her hands. She was accustomed to much heavier weapons with more substantial calibers. This felt like trying to write with a pencil after using a thick marker. But a rifle was a rifle, and the fundamentals remained the same. Sarah settled into her stance, feeling muscle memory take over. Her breathing naturally slowed and deepened. The noise and chatter of the range began to fade as she entered the focused state her grandfather had taught her to find. She raised the rifle, settled the stock against her shoulder, and peered through the basic iron sights. The target seemed absurdly close at 25 yards. She'd been making shots 10 times the distance since she was a teenager. Her first shot struck dead center of the bull's eye. The sharp crack of the .22 was followed by an unusual silence. Conversations paused as nearby shooters glanced over to see the result. Sarah barely noticed. She was already settling in for her second shot. Another perfect bullseye. By the fourth shot, she had attracted a small crowd. By the 10th shot, conversations had stopped entirely. Sarah had placed 10 consecutive rounds within the bullseye, creating a single ragged hole in the center of the target. Lucky streak, someone muttered, but the comment lacked conviction. Sarah's next 10 shots were equally precise. She was unconsciously demonstrating the breathing techniques and mental discipline her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. Each shot was deliberate, controlled, and perfectly placed. "Jesus," whispered one of the watching men. "Look at that grouping." Jennifer stood watching with her mouth open, suddenly realizing that her quiet roommate was doing something extraordinary. The men who had been offering condescending advice minutes earlier were now studying Sarah's technique with serious attention. But Sarah's demonstration had only begun. She was just getting warmed up, and something deep inside her was awakening. Something that had been dormant for 2 years was stirring to life, and she could feel the familiar thrill of precision shooting flowing through her veins like electricity. The little .22 rifle suddenly didn't feel so inadequate anymore. In the right hands, Sarah was beginning to remember, any weapon could be devastating. And she was definitely the right hands. Word of Sarah's shooting spread through the range faster than wildfire. Within minutes, shooters from every lane had migrated toward her position, forming a semicircle of curious onlookers. The afternoon sun beat down on the outdoor range as more people emerged from the indoor facilities to see what was causing the commotion. "Beginner's luck," declared a voice from the crowd. The speaker was a tall, heavy-set man with a gray beard and camouflage cap. His name tag identified him as an NRA instructor, and his belt displayed enough shooting awards and certifications to stock a trophy shop. Nobody shoots like that their first time at a range. Sarah lowered her rifle and turned to face the speaker. She'd been so focused on her shooting that she hadn't realized how much attention she'd attracted. The crowd made her uncomfortable, but something in the man's dismissive tone sparked a familiar fire in her chest. "I never said it was my first time," Sarah replied quietly. The instructor, whose name was Chuck Morrison according to his various badges, stepped forward with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to being the authority in any firearms discussion. At 58 years old, Chuck had been teaching marksmanship for over 20 years. He'd trained police officers, military personnel, and competitive shooters. In his mind, there was nothing about firearms he hadn't seen or couldn't do better than anyone else. "Well then, little lady, where exactly did you learn to shoot like that?" Chuck's question carried an undertone of skepticism, as if he couldn't believe Sarah's ability was genuine. "Colorado," Sarah answered simply. She had no interest in providing her life story to satisfy this man's curiosity. Chuck laughed, a sound that grated against Sarah's nerves like sandpaper. "Colorado, huh? Well, that explains the hunting background. But shooting paper targets is a different game entirely. What you just did was impressive for someone who learned on tin cans and rabbits, but this is precision marksmanship. The crowd murmured agreement. Several men nodded as if Chuck had explained away Sarah's performance with his superior wisdom. Sarah felt the familiar sting of being patronized, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times since leaving the mountains. Jennifer, still amazed by her roommate's hidden talent, stepped forward defensively. She just shot perfect scores on 20 straight shots. How is that not precision marksmanship? Chuck's smile was condescending. Because she's shooting at 25 yards with a .22 caliber rifle. That's like playing basketball with a 6-foot hoop. Any decent shooter can hit a target that close with that little gun. He gestured toward the far end of the range, where targets were positioned at much greater distances. Real marksmanship happens at 100 yards and beyond, with rifles that have some actual power. What she's doing is impressive for a beginner, but it's not what we'd call serious shooting. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, "Never let pride make you stupid, Nija. But, never let anyone make you feel small when you know your worth." What would you consider serious shooting? Sarah asked, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. Chuck's grin widened. He sensed an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise in front of an audience, something he never passed up. "Well, since you asked, let me show you what real precision looks like." He walked to his equipment bag and pulled out a custom rifle that looked like it cost more than Sarah's college tuition for a year. The scope alone was probably worth more than most people's cars. Chuck handled the weapon with the reverence of someone showing off a prized possession. This beauty is a Remington 700 with a custom barrel, precision trigger, and Schmidt & Bender scope. She's chambered in .308 Winchester and shoots sub-MOA groups at distances most people can't even see clearly. The technical jargon was meant to impress the crowd and intimidate Sarah. Chuck continued his lecture as he set up at a shooting bench designed for precision work. "I'll be shooting at the 200-yard target. That's 8 times farther than what you were shooting at, and I'll be using a cartridge with 10 times the power." As Chuck prepared his equipment with elaborate ceremony, Sarah noticed other shooters placing informal bets on the outcome. Most seemed confident that Chuck would easily outperform her. After all, he was using professional equipment at a much more challenging distance. But Sarah was studying Chuck's technique with critical eyes. She watched how he adjusted his scope, positioned himself on the shooting bench, and prepared his ammunition. Everything about his approach screamed of someone who had learned by the book but lacked the intuitive understanding that came from years of necessity-driven shooting. Chuck fired his first shot, and the electronic target system displayed the result, a hit just outside the bullseye at 200 yards. The crowd murmured approval. It was a solid shot by most standards. "Not bad for a warm-up," Chuck announced, making a show of adjusting his scope. His next 4 shots formed a respectable group about 3 inches in diameter, all within the scoring rings of the target. 5 shots, average score of 8.2 out of 10, Chuck announced proudly. "Let's see you match that at 200 yards, Colorado." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah realized that everyone on the range was now watching this impromptu competition. She could walk away, go back to her dorm room, and continue living her quiet, anonymous college life. Or she could accept the challenge and show these people what real mountain shooting looked like. But there was a problem. Chuck's expensive rifle was calibrated for his specific shooting style and preferences. Sarah would need to use an unfamiliar weapon to make her attempt, which put her at a significant disadvantage. "I'll need to borrow a rifle," Sarah said finally. "I don't have equipment for 200-yard shooting." Chuck's grin became predatory. "Of course you don't. Tell you what, I'll let you use my backup rifle. It's a standard hunting gun, nothing fancy, but it should be more than adequate for someone with your claimed abilities." He produced a basic bolt-action rifle in .30-06 caliber, a common hunting cartridge. The rifle was clean and well-maintained but lacked the custom features of Chuck's primary weapon. More importantly, it had a simple scope that would require Sarah to estimate ranges and compensate for bullet drop without the advanced features Chuck's scope provided. Sarah accepted the rifle and spent a few minutes familiarizing herself with its action and trigger. The weight and balance felt more natural than the lightweight .22 she'd been using earlier. This was closer to the rifles she'd learned on in Colorado. "Take all the time you need to get comfortable," Chuck said magnanimously. "No rush." But Sarah was already settling into position. She'd spotted several things about Chuck's shooting that she could improve on, and she was eager to demonstrate the difference between technical shooting and instinctive marksmanship. The crowd had grown larger as word spread throughout the facility. Even Sarge had emerged from behind the counter to watch the show. Someone had started taking bets on the outcome, with most money going on Chuck to win decisively. Sarah's first shot at 200 yards struck the bullseye dead center. The electronic target system displayed a perfect 10. The crowd fell silent, unsure if this was another lucky shot or the beginning of something extraordinary. Sarah worked the bolt action smoothly, chambered another round, and settled back into position. Her breathing had found its natural rhythm, and the familiar calm was settling over her mind like a favorite blanket. The second shot struck within millimeters of the first. Chuck's confident expression began to shift toward concern. "Decent start," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier cockiness. Sarah's third shot opened the hole slightly but remained well within the bullseye. Her fourth shot was equally precise. By the time she fired her fifth and final shot, she had created a single ragged hole in the exact center of the 200-yard target. The electronic scoring system calculated her average, 10.0 out of 10. Perfect score. The silence stretched for several seconds before someone whispered, "Holy shit." Chuck stared at the target display in disbelief. His respectable 8.2 average had been completely obliterated by Sarah's flawless performance. Using his backup rifle, shooting an unfamiliar caliber, she had achieved something he'd never accomplished even with his custom equipment. "Lucky streak," Chuck said weakly, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Run it again," called out a voice from the crowd. "Let's see if she can do it twice." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. The condescension and amusement had been replaced by genuine interest and, in some cases, respect. For the first time since leaving Colorado, she felt like she belonged somewhere. "Your choice," Chuck said, trying to regain his composure. But lightning rarely strikes twice in the same place. Sarah considered the challenge. Her grandfather had taught her that true skill wasn't demonstrated by a single good performance, but by consistency under pressure. These people didn't believe what they'd just seen. They thought it was an accident. It was time to show them it wasn't. "Same distance, same rifle?" Sarah asked. Chuck nodded, though he was clearly hoping she would decline the rematch. Sarah reloaded the rifle with 5 fresh cartridges. The crowd pressed closer, creating an amphitheater of observers around the shooting bench. Cell phones appeared as people began recording the second round. This time, Sarah took even less time to settle into position. Her confidence was building with each shot, and muscle memory was taking over completely. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, and the distant target seemed as large as the side of a barn. Her first shot of the second round struck exactly where she intended, dead center bullseye. The second shot enlarged the hole slightly. By the third shot, even Chuck had stopped making excuses and was watching with professional interest. Whatever Sarah was doing, it wasn't luck. This was skill at a level he'd rarely witnessed. The fourth shot maintained the perfect grouping. When Sarah fired her final shot of the second round, the target showed another perfect 10.0 average. 2 consecutive perfect scores at 200 yards, using an unfamiliar rifle. The crowd erupted in genuine applause. Chuck Morrison, master instructor and 20-year veteran of precision shooting, had just been outshot twice in a row by a college girl from Colorado using his own backup equipment. But Chuck wasn't finished. His pride was wounded, and his reputation was on the line in front of people who looked to him as an expert. If he couldn't beat this girl with superior equipment at a longer distance, he'd lose credibility that had taken decades to build. "Impressive shooting," Chuck admitted grudgingly. "But 200 yards is still within the range of basic marksmanship. Anyone can get lucky at that distance with enough practice." He paused dramatically, surveying the crowd to make sure he had their attention. "The real test of a marksman is long-range precision. How about we step it up to 400 yards? That's where the men get separated from the boys. Sarah felt a familiar thrill run through her body. Chuck was offering her exactly what she'd been craving without realizing it, a real challenge. Something that would push her abilities and remind her who she really was underneath the college student disguise. 400 yards, she repeated slowly. What stakes did you have in mind? Chuck's eyes gleamed. He thought he'd found her breaking point, the distance where her beginner's luck would finally run out. If you can match my shooting at 400 yards, I'll personally apologize to you in front of everyone here. Hell, I'll even buy your range time for the rest of the year. He leaned forward confidentially, lowering his voice so only Sarah could hear. But, when you can't match my shooting at that distance, you admit that what you did was a fluke, and you stop pretending to be something you're not. Sarah considered the proposal. Chuck was essentially betting his reputation against hers, assuming she didn't have one to lose. He had no idea that he was about to face skills developed not on a comfortable shooting range, but in the harsh mountains where missing meant going hungry and poor shooting could mean the difference between life and death. Deal, Sarah said simply. The crowd buzzed with excitement. This had evolved from a casual afternoon at the range into a genuine competition between two very different kinds of marksmen. Old-school technical expertise against natural ability. Expensive equipment against raw skill. As Chuck began setting up targets at the 400-yard line, Sarah quietly prepared herself for the challenge of her life. Not because 400 yards was beyond her capability, but because she was about to reveal abilities she'd kept hidden for 2 years. Her quiet college life was about to come to an end, one way or another. The 400-yard range stretched out like an endless football field under the blazing Texas sun. At that distance, the target appeared as a tiny speck, barely visible to the naked eye even with perfect vision. Most recreational shooters never attempted shots beyond 200 yards, considering anything farther to be the domain of military snipers and elite competitive marksmen. Chuck Morrison set up his premium equipment with the confidence of someone who had made this shot countless times before. His custom rifle gleamed in the afternoon light, and he made a show of adjusting his high-end scope with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. At this distance, Chuck announced to the gathered crowd, "We're dealing with serious ballistics calculations. Wind drift, bullet drop, atmospheric pressure, there are dozens of variables that can affect the shot. This isn't point and shoot anymore." Sarah listened to his lecture while studying the range conditions. The afternoon heat was creating subtle wind patterns that most people wouldn't notice, but her grandfather had taught her to read air currents like a book. She watched the grass sway, felt the breeze against her skin, and noted how dust particles moved in the distance. Chuck fired his first shot at the 400-yard target. The electronic system registered a hit in the 7 ring, just outside the bullseye. Respectable for most shooters, but not the dominant performance he'd been hoping for. Warming up, Chuck muttered, making minute adjustments to his scope. His second shot improved to an 8. The third and fourth shots were similar, clustering in the 7 and 8 rings. His final shot managed a 9. Average score of 7.8, Chuck announced, trying to sound satisfied. That's solid shooting at this distance. Most people would be thrilled with that performance. The crowd murmured agreement, but Sarah noticed the lack of enthusiasm in their response. Chuck's shooting was competent but not spectacular. For someone who had been bragging about his expertise, it seemed like a disappointment. Now it was Sarah's turn. She approached the shooting bench with Chuck's backup rifle, the same weapon she'd used for her previous demonstrations. At 400 yards, the disadvantages of using unfamiliar equipment would be magnified significantly. Chuck's custom scope was calibrated for his specific rifle and ammunition combination, while Sarah would be relying on basic optics and her own calculations. But, as Sarah settled into position, something remarkable happened. The noise and distractions of the shooting range began to fade away, replaced by the profound silence she remembered from her mountain hunts. Her breathing naturally slowed and deepened. Her heartbeat became steady and controlled. She was no longer a college student trying to prove herself to a crowd of strangers. She was 8 years old again, sitting beside her grandfather as he taught her to become one with the rifle, to let instinct and training merge into something greater than the sum of their parts. Remember, Mija, she could hear Miguel's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. The rifle is just a tool. The real weapon is your mind. Make your mind still, and the bullet will go where your heart tells it to go. Sarah peered through the scope at the distant target. At 400 yards, it appeared as a small circle with barely visible scoring rings. She began making the mental calculations her grandfather had drilled into her: distance compensation, wind drift, bullet trajectory. But, unlike Chuck's mechanical approach, Sarah's calculations were intuitive, based on feel and experience rather than formulas and charts. The first thing she noticed was that Chuck had been overcompensating for wind drift. The breeze was actually lighter than it appeared, and the temperature inversion was creating an updraft that would lift the bullet slightly. These were subtle conditions that required instinctive understanding rather than textbook knowledge. Sarah's first shot at 400 yards struck the bullseye. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Chuck's confident expression cracked as he stared at the target display showing a perfect 10. Using his backup rifle with basic equipment, Sarah had achieved what he couldn't do with his custom setup. Lucky shot, Chuck said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah worked the bolt action and chambered her second round. The familiar rhythm of precision shooting had taken complete control now. She wasn't thinking about the crowd or the competition anymore. She was simply doing what she'd been trained to do since childhood: place bullets exactly where they needed to go. Her second shot struck within millimeters of the first, creating a single hole in the center of the bullseye. The electronic system registered another 10. Chuck was no longer making comments. He watched in growing amazement as Sarah demonstrated a level of marksmanship that transcended anything he'd encountered in his 20 years of instruction. This wasn't technique or equipment mastery. This was something approaching artistry. Sarah's third shot enlarged the hole slightly but remained well within the bullseye. Her fourth shot was equally precise. The crowd had fallen completely silent, mesmerized by the demonstration of skills they'd never imagined possible. When Sarah fired her final shot, she knew it was perfect before the bullet even reached the target. She could feel the accuracy in the rifle's recoil, in the way the shot broke cleanly, in the absolute stillness of her mind at the moment of firing. The target system displayed her final score, 10.0 average. 5 consecutive bullseyes at 400 yards. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before the crowd erupted in genuine amazement. Applause and cheers echoed across the range as shooters who had been skeptical an hour earlier acknowledged they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Chuck Morrison stood staring at the target display as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His comfortable worldview had been shattered by a quiet college girl who had just demonstrated mastery that exceeded his own by an enormous margin. But, instead of congratulating Sarah or graciously admitting defeat, Chuck's wounded pride drove him to one final desperate gambit. "Anyone can get lucky once," he announced loudly, trying to regain the crowd's attention. But real marksmen prove themselves under pressure, with stakes that matter. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a thick roll of cash. "I've got $500 here that says she can't do it again. Same distance, same conditions, but this time with money on the line." The crowd murmured with interest. $500 was serious money, especially for a college student. Chuck was essentially betting that Sarah's performance had been a fluke that she couldn't repeat under pressure. Sarah looked at the cash in Chuck's hand, then at the faces of the people surrounding her. She realized this moment had become about more than just shooting. It was about respect, about proving that skill and determination mattered more than equipment and swagger. "I don't have $500 to match your bet," Sarah said quietly. Chuck's grin returned. He thought he'd found her weak spot, the point where her confidence would finally crack. "Then, I guess we'll never know if you're really as good as you pretend to be. But," Sarah continued, "I'll make you a different wager." The crowd leaned in, eager to hear her proposal. "If I can put 5 shots in a smaller group than you just shot, you donate that $500 to the youth shooting program here at the range. Kids who can't afford equipment but want to learn." Chuck hesitated. He'd been expecting Sarah to back down when faced with a monetary challenge, not counter with a proposal that would put his money at risk either way. "And if you can't match my shooting?" he asked. "Then, I'll publicly apologize for wasting everyone's time, and I'll never set foot on this range again." The stakes couldn't have been higher. Chuck would either lose his money or his reputation. Sarah would either establish herself as a legitimate marksman or be banned from the place where she'd finally felt like she belonged. Chuck looked around at the crowd, realizing he'd painted himself into a corner. If he backed down now, he'd look like a coward. If he accepted and lost, he'd be out $500 and his credibility. "Deal," he said finally. Sarah nodded and returned to the shooting bench. This time, the pressure was entirely different. It wasn't just about proving her abilities anymore. It was about earning the respect of people who shared her passion for precision and accuracy. As she settled into position for what everyone knew would be the deciding round, Sarah felt a profound calm settle over her. This was the moment her grandfather had been preparing her for without either of them knowing it. All those cold mornings on the mountain, all those hours practicing until her shoulders ached, all those lessons about patience and breathing and becoming still inside her own mind, it had all led to this. The distant target seemed to grow larger as Sarah's focus intensified. The crowd, the pressure, even Chuck's sneering presence faded away until there was only the rifle, the target, and the sacred space between them. Her first shot struck the exact center of the bullseye with surgical precision. The second shot struck so close to the first that the holes nearly overlapped. By the third shot, even Chuck had stopped hoping for a miss and was watching with professional fascination. He was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about marksmanship. Sarah's fourth shot maintained the impossibly tight grouping. When she fired her final shot, the electronic target system showed something that brought gasps from the experienced shooters in the crowd. Sarah had fired 5 shots into a group smaller than a quarter at 400 yards. Her precision was so exceptional that it approached the theoretical limits of the rifle's accuracy. Chuck stared at the results in stunned silence. He'd been comprehensively outshot by someone using his backup equipment, someone who had learned to shoot not in a classroom or on a comfortable range, but in the unforgiving mountains where precision meant survival. The crowd's applause was thunderous this time. Even shooters who had been skeptical at the beginning were now acknowledging they'd witnessed something remarkable. Sarah had proven that real skill transcended equipment, gender, or formal training. Chuck slowly reached into his wallet and extracted 5 $100 bills. His hands shook slightly as he approached Sarah, the weight of his defeat settling heavily on his shoulders. "I don't know where you learned to shoot like that," he said quietly, "but it wasn't luck. That was the most impressive marksmanship I've ever seen." He handed Sarah the money. "For the youth program, as agreed. And I owe you an apology. I judged you based on appearances instead of ability, and that was wrong." Sarah accepted the money with a gracious nod. "My grandfather always said the gun doesn't know if you're a man or woman. Only the bullet knows the truth." Word of the competition spread throughout the Texas shooting community like wildfire. Within days, Sarah was receiving invitations to competitive events, offers of sponsorship from equipment manufacturers, and requests for interviews from sporting magazines. But, more importantly, she had rediscovered something she'd lost when she left the mountains: her identity. She wasn't just a displaced college student trying to fit into an unfamiliar world. She was a marksman with skills that had been passed down through generations, refined by necessity, and perfected through dedication. The shooting range became Sarah's second home. She started spending afternoons there instead of hiding in her dorm room, and gradually built friendships with people who respected her abilities and shared her passion. Chuck Morrison became one of her strongest supporters, often telling newcomers about the day he learned not to judge a shooter by their appearance. Sarah's college grades improved dramatically as her confidence returned. She changed her major to mechanical engineering with a focus on ballistics, combining her natural shooting ability with formal technical knowledge. After graduation, she was recruited by a major firearms manufacturer to help design precision rifle systems. But she never forgot the lesson of that afternoon at the Lone Star shooting range. When young shooters, especially girls, came to her feeling intimidated or dismissed, She would tell them the story of the day she proved that quiet determination and genuine skill would always triumph over arrogance and assumptions. Jennifer still talks about the roommate who seemed so quiet and ordinary until the day she picked up a rifle and reminded an entire shooting range that excellence can come from the most unexpected places. And, somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, Miguel Martinez's spirit probably smiled, knowing that the lessons he'd taught his granddaughter had finally found their proper stage, and that the quiet girl he'd trained to survive had grown into a woman who thrived.